Welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Zoe Hawkins, and my friend and co-host Jo Wheatley.
Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk to you about our own emotional archetypes model. And the reason that we're going to share this with you is to give you a little bit of insight into one of the things contained within our emotions coaching practitioner training. And also we shared this on an European Mentoring and Coaching Council or EMCC webinar recently. And those that attended loved it and wanted to hear more about it. So we're going to share some of the principles from that with you today to help you to think about what you can look out for when you're in conversations with your coachees.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the purpose of these emotional archetypes is to help to raise awareness of your client's relationship with their emotions. So for us, all coaching is about emotion. So if you think about a goal that your client has brought to coaching or that you have brought to coaching, take a step back from that goal for a moment and just connect with what was the reason in the first place that you brought that goal to coaching. It's likely to have been a source of motivation, perhaps, or fulfillment that you were seeking. Or maybe it was an emotion that you're experiencing that was frustrating for you. So it may have been something was frustrating or something was annoying or something was feeling like it was missing. Perhaps you've gone to coaching with a sense of, desire. Ultimately, everything that you bring to coaching, emotion is part of the reason why you're there. And so a lot of the work that we would do in coaching will touch on emotions because it is a universal human experience and a core part of coaching. So where should we start with this particular concept, Jo?
I think let's start by giving a walkthrough of the model, and then we can explore different parts of it in turn. Essentially, in this emotional archetypes model, there are 4 different relationships that people have with their emotions. And the first one that we'll start off with is emotional freedom. We see that as being like an end goal, like an ideal relationship or state to have in terms of your relationship with your emotions. And we'll talk about that in more detail. And the other 3 are emotional flooding, emotional stonewalling, and emotional fragmentation. And the factors that influence how, as a coach, you can consider and help your client to learn about their relationship with their emotions is the degree of connection that they have to their emotions. So whether that is strong or whether that is weaker for them. And when we talk about emotional connection, we're talking about, does your client feel comfortable when they make contact with their range of emotions? Is that something that they are happy to experience? Are they aware of the relationship that different emotions have and their different emotional experience? How big is their emotional range? Do they have access to 50 different emotions or 5 different emotions? And are they able to accept their emotional experience, or does your client tend to reject an emotion or a connection to an emotional experience? So those are some of the things we consider when we're exploring with our clients about their connection to their emotions. Zoe, do you want to chat through the emotional literacy, which is the other thing that helps to define the 4 archetypes?
Yeah, of course. So emotional literacy is really about how able is your client in describing the emotional experience that they're having at any one point in time. And as Jo said there, around what emotions do your client have access to? This is like, what words, what vocabulary, what phrases is your client actually able to access to describe the experience that they're having? So for some people, they may be able to talk really fluidly about a whole range of emotions and be very articulate in being able to describe what it is that they're experiencing from one moment to the next. With some clients, they may have a very limited range to be able to describe that. So they might know that they're feeling angry, but that's as far as they can go with describing that sensation of anger that they're having. Whereas somebody with a wide range of accessible phrases, words and sentences might be able to explain that they're feeling angry, and that, at the source of their anger is a frustration and an infuriation with this particular topic. And they can describe how that might feel both in their body and in their mind. And they might be able to describe the reasons why they don't like that experience. So having literacy enables us to be understood, because we can articulate what we are experiencing at any one point in time to other people to help to make our experiences known. And so that kind of leads us then into what Joe was saying, emotional freedom being the destination. So if you bring those two pieces together around emotional connection and emotional literacy, what you have is a client or somebody who is both able to accept their emotional experience for what it is, to be able to sit with emotions that both feel comfortable and uncomfortable. You actually can allow yourself to feel those emotions in the first place, and you have the skills, the ability and the capacity to be able to describe that experience to other people. So the reason why this is called emotional freedom is because you're in a place where you have the ability to make yourself understood by others, and you aren't put off by your emotional experience. You accept it for what it is, and you're able to process that experience. So that means that you can be experiencing emotions like anger or sadness or guilt or loneliness without them overwhelming you. Just being able to sit there and notice that it's happening, accept it, describe it to others, and that can help you to access what you need in order to process that emotion more successfully or quicker or more efficiently, whatever the words are that you describe. So when you have that emotional relationship, you find that you are more able to kind of move through the different emotions that life may present for you without problem. That's not to say the emotions that you're having you don't enjoy, but you don't judge them and make them into something that then breeds even more and more and more.
Yeah, ultimately, you see your emotions as valuable to you and your human experience, and both in the here and now, and also what you're looking to achieve moving forwards. If we take emotional fragmentation and consider it against these two elements of emotional connection and emotional literacy, emotional fragmentation would be somebody that has strong emotional literacy, so they can tell you about how they're feeling, but there is almost like a barrier between them acting and experiencing it. And so there's a disconnect that they experience. So some ways that you might be able to notice that with a client might be that they can get impatient with other people. And when we say other people that they perceive to get emotional and get in their emotional experience. So there's a degree of efficiency that often drives people that experience emotional fragmentation. Because they are able to describe it, but there's a disconnect to their feeling, they might find it difficult to build relationships with other people, that feeling of intimacy. And some people might experience them as being intimidating. So if you think in a work setting, they could be very clear about how they feel, but then it's kind of move on. Or they might even ask other people how they feel, but not really in a compassionate way, in a way that they understand that connection to it. And because they're able to articulate it but not really experience it, sometimes their own needs can get overlooked because of that degree of speed that's often related to emotional fragmentation.
So if we take a moment to look at another one of these archetypes, it's considered the stonewalling. So this is somebody who would have a limited emotional range. So that's not being able to access the words to describe the emotional experience they're having, coupled with limited emotional connection. So, not necessarily allowing themselves to have that emotional experience, or perhaps denying themselves an emotional experience, or a habit of sweeping it under the carpet, like ignoring that this emotional experience is happening. And one of the challenges, I suppose, with this particular archetype is around being comfortable in emotional situations. It might be a discomfort with relationships when other people are experiencing emotional, not feeling like you don't have the skills to be able to sit and hold that emotional space for others. It may be a rushing through of those emotions. And that can obviously really limit the relationships that you build. It can also make the client feel very misunderstood or unappreciated. So they may be going through life, swooping their emotions to one side, not really talking about their emotions. So it's very hard for people to know how that person is actually feeling. So under the surface, that person might be feeling sad or lonely or hurt or angry, but no one is paying attention to that. And no one's paying attention to that because they also aren't paying attention to that. And so that can lead to feelings of being just misunderstood and unappreciated, and that sense of like, no one understands me. So supporting a client with both extending their range of literacy to describe their emotions and also helping them to feel safety in experiencing their emotions can really help them to build connection with others. And this is important when you have clients who have values around things like connection, relationship, team, fun even, like where do those things come from? So helping your client, if they're coming to a coaching session and they're expressing these unmet needs, it might be worth using something like the archetypes model to help your client to understand where they are in relationship to their emotions and how that might relate to the challenge they're experiencing.
Yeah, often when clients are feeling, confused around a situation, and if you introduce the model because they're interested, the answer is usually very quickly, oh my goodness, that's me. That's totally me. And of course, we approach coaching with a growth mindset and support our clients to develop a growth mindset. So it's just a starting point for them to understand themselves and to feel understood by the coach that they're with. So it's just that starting point for exploration and how do they want to develop their relationship with it? Because somebody that experiences stonewalling, the one that we were just talking about, is often feeling silently overwhelmed. But as a result of the stonewalling, they tend to take on more and more stuff, more things than they can realistically cope with. So there's an irony there that in blocking out, the strategy being to block out their emotional experience, it's actually because of an emotional experience that they are having. And it's a limited coping strategy. It can only work for so long. And so it might be about supporting your client to develop other coping strategies that also enable them to develop both the emotional literacy as well as the safety and confidence in making full contact or connection to their emotional experience. The final one out of the four, so we've talked about emotional freedom, we've talked about emotional fragmentation, we've talked about emotional stonewalling. And the final one is emotional flooding. And that might be something that is familiar to some of you that are listening, or might be one where you're like, oh, don't talk about it, Jo. I don't like that one. So just notice your reaction as we're discussing each of these different quadrants. So emotional flooding is where there's a high degree of emotional connection, but a limited degree of emotional literacy. And so people can often misinterpret an individual that experiences emotional flooding as being somebody that doesn't cope well or lacks resilience in some way. And the individual can feel lonely in their emotional experience and can find it hard to make sense of their emotional experience. And the loneliness can come from, this is all going on internally, but they struggle to articulate it to others. And so it can become very confusing, and the client can do what we call looping, which is getting stuck in that emotional, or even kind of going into a bit of a spiral. And you might also find them discounting their emotional experience by starting their explanation of, I just feel. And that word just it has a discounting impact. Now they can feel ultimately like the emotions are in control of them. And so they can feel disempowered to step into action because they are consumed with trying to make sense of the feelings and also to contain them. So they often feel like, this thing just keeps getting bigger, even when they're trying to contain it or stonewall it in some way. But they're often, when people are caught in this type. Sometimes that's situational, lots of things happen at the same time. And so at that moment in time, that might be something a client experiences or a stress reaction. So it's not to say that people exist wholly in one of these categories, but it's about, sometimes it's helpful to help our clients understand what is their experience in the here and now, when they're describing things in a coaching session, what can help them to achieve their goals.
I mean, many clients who would identify with stonewalling often have a stonewalling strategy because they fear the flooding strategy. So instead of like having the emotions come in, they push them behind the stone wall, so they lock them away. And often what happens when stonewalling, you start to work on that strategy, is you start to open up a little bit of the gate, and then the flooding happens. But after the flooding, the freedom comes. So when you're helping and supporting your client to understand their emotional relationships, and obviously this is goal context dependent as well, the journey isn't necessarily that you identify with stonewalling and then you get to freedom, or you may have a number of these different archetypes that you identify with depending on what is happening for you at any one point in time. But often just by acknowledging that there is a possibility of emotional freedom creates a new reality for people, which is, well, that sounds nice. I think that could be really helpful for me in this context. So it introduces choice and options into the space where sometimes the client feels like they have none. And it normalizes people's emotional experiences. So I would identify stonewalling. That's always been in the past like my go-to strategy. And now that is something that really only happens to me under times of what I would describe as extreme stress for me. It's an old strategy that comes out, but I recognize when I'm doing it. And because I recognize that I'm doing it, I'm able to think, oh, what do I need right now to be able to support me to get out of that strategy? And so I've learned my needs. And so that helps me to process those times of extreme stress more effectively, more efficiently, get back to action quicker, get on with my goals in a more fluid way. So emotions are, for us, a really critical part of goal achievement in coaching, because we have all of these things go on that interrupt the flow of our energy and our focus on what it is that we are there to achieve in the first place.
Yeah, and emotions are a type of energy. So if the blocker is that, the client is feeling fear or sadness about something ending, when, by doing something new, they're starting something new, but something else is ending, they can start, if they engage in this idea of, I can choose an emotional experience that's going to resource me to be able to take the action. And that's great. Now, some clients will say, emotional freedom, I don't like that term. Great. That's great, because they're considering what it means, and that perhaps it means something to them, but the label doesn't work for them. And so as a coach, you can say, so how would you describe that relationship to your emotions? And then as soon as the client starts making it their own, you know that there's that sense of developing understanding for them. And as Zoe was saying, it's about relating it to the goal. So when we think about the goal that you have for today's session, or that bigger term goal that you've got, how can you use what we've just explored to support you to achieve that in the way that you want to? Because we know sometimes the blocker is like achieving the goal, but sometimes it's about they want to have a certain emotional experience whilst they're achieving the goal, and they want the security around that. So if you ask your client, so you notice a gap in the coaching conversations where when the client talks very much about what they think, all of their answers are starting with that, and you don't hear very much about what they feel. And then you start to say, so I hear that you're thinking these things. I'm curious, what is it that you're feeling? And then the client's like, oh, I don't know what I'm feeling. I'm just thinking this. Okay, well, would it be useful if we spent a bit of time exploring how you feel about that? And they're like, well, I never really think about what I feel about this. Okay, is that something you want to get more familiar with? Could that be helpful to you as you think about achieving your goal? Well, how might it be helpful? Or yes, I think it would be helpful. So what is your relationship with your emotions at the moment? And the client says, well, what do you mean? That might be a place to say, well, It'd be useful if I shared a model with you that talks through the different types of relationships that people can have emotions, and that might resonate with you, or it might not, but it might just start to give you some ideas to reflect on as you think about your relationship with your emotions. So when we share models, we share them in an attached way with the client. We ask for permission to share them, to consider they think that it would be useful. And it's not to put people into boxes, but it's to be able to give them often a catalyst really for their own reflections.
Yeah. So if you think about typical goals, something like somebody comes to coaching because they want to be a great leader. Great. What's a way to be a great leader when you can have connected relationships with people, when you can hold space for somebody when they are feeling emotional, when you have the confidence and the strategies to support people with both the task that they are facing as well as how they are experiencing that. That's all about emotion. So this would be a really relevant piece of work to introduce to somebody who's looking for leadership development and increasing self-awareness. And when you do that, you're doing it by tying back the exploration to their goal. So when you are in this quadrant or this archetype of emotional stonewalling, what impact do you feel that has on your leadership? How might your team be experiencing you when you're in an emotional stonewalling place? And what about flooding? What are the situations that evoke that in you in your leadership role? So you will use the client's context to make it relevant to them and what they're trying to achieve.
And if you're listening to this and thinking, so, and what else would I do with this? We obviously have a number of different coaching activities and tools that we share on the Emotions Coaching Practitioner training that give you a question bank and a semi-structure to be able to support clients to explore this work. And you can find details of that on our website, which is igcompany.co.uk/emotions coaching.